So welcome everyone to the JB Media Digital Drop-In. I'm so glad to see you all today. I can see some other folks joining us as we get to the top of the hour. So thanks for being here. Please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat just so people can see who's joining us today. Your name, your business or organization, and your location would be great. And thanks for jumping in and kicking us off, Alyssa. I appreciate it. But I want to go over just a few housekeeping things before we kick into the content for today. First, just a reminder that I'll be recording everything and I'll also be sharing the slide deck usually by tomorrow. So as soon as we get everything done, I'll process that and then we'll send an email out. And as usual, I want to encourage everyone, just in case you haven't attended a drop-in before, please feel free to share any type of video recording or slide deck that we ever give you from our webinars with other people that you think can use the information. We are really wide open to the content that we're producing for free, that be something that you feel like you can give to other people. So I've been talking to a lot of my students lately, and I just wanted to remind everybody that you can do that, because sometimes we have great conversations here that you can take back to your team. And I want you to feel really comfortable with that, just sharing our information or even inviting other people to come to our monthly webinars. I also just want to say thank you all so much for switching to a Thursday. If you weren't here when we first logged on, you might not have heard that I had a great class yesterday at the Asheville Chamber of Commerce. So I know we usually do the first Wednesday of every month, and I just appreciate everyone being willing to shift our norm a little bit and go to a Thursday. And hopefully that means actually some of you are able to come live that can't usually come. And then the other thing I just wanted to remind everybody is that this year, as we are doing a lot of different webinars, we are matching them with different types of classes each week. And so when you attend a webinar, we are usually providing some type of class to go with it at the end of the month. And so I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the webinar today and share that link. But if you like what you hear, just remember, we will give you an opportunity to dig deeper into these topics than we can in just, a little under an hour on our lunch hour. But that leads me to introducing Abby Rapoport from Stranger's Guide. And I'm so glad that she's with us here today. Most of you who know me know that as the lead instructor of the JB Media Institute, I spend a lot of my time working with people on content strategy, and especially talking about the power of storytelling and really encouraging us to not just sort of have that, knowledge of marketing requires us to tell stories. I think we already all know that, but really understanding, like, how do you tell great stories? Right? How do you actually, in a sea of information on the internet and 7.5 billion people on the planet and millions of brands and organizations and destinations and companies marketing different things, how do you really make your stories kind of stick with people, right? How do we actually make them stand out from the crowd? And I think there's so much that we can dig into there. And Abby's background in journalism and writing and a lot of the other things that she's done, we have somebody on staff here at JB Media, Mandy Gardner, who's also got a similar background. And even Jenna, who many of you know from the Institute, also worked in journalism for a long time. So I think there's some amazing things that we can talk about in how we don't just tell stories, but how we really connect with people, how we unearth stories that maybe we haven't told before, and how we just take a more creative and strategic approach to how we're doing our storytelling every day. So Abby, thank you so much for being here. I'd love for you to jump in. And if you want, share a little bit about the Stranger's Guide and what you all are doing. And then you can jump into your presentation. And as usual, just so everyone knows, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that and making sure that we answer them today.
Great. So Sarah, you'll interrupt me with questions, right?
Yeah,
that would be great. Perfect. Yes. So I'm just sort of, laying things out, but really look forward to folks asking questions, because there's so many directions. It's a broad topic, storytelling. So would love to take it in some of the directions that y'all are looking for. But let me put on my little slideshow here. Oh, wait, no, I forgot to. Let me share my screen first and then put on the slideshow, because I think that's a better order. All right. Here we we go. All right, so my name is Abby Rapoport, like Sarah said, and I am the co-founder and publisher of Stranger's Guide. I started life very far from what I do now as a political reporter and kind of education reporter, so very kind of policy focused. But I always love the role of place and storytelling. That was always kind of one of my core interests. And I live in Texas. I'm from Texas, and when I would be writing about a school board fight or a political candidate, understanding the community and its values and its kind of position and worldview is so central to understanding anything else about it. And so, sort of fast forwarding through a few different twists and turns, a close friend and colleague of mine started a publication called Stranger's Guide, which was focused entirely on place-based reporting and place-based storytelling. And our view is that place-based storytelling really had this capacity in some unique ways to challenge stereotypes, to give people a broader sense of global exchange, cultural exchange, and so forth. So each of our issues focuses on a single location. They're all evergreen, so they're designed to really be sort of collectible that you can return to again and again. They're available both in print and online. And we use all writers from each location, writers and photographers. So 80% of the writers and photographers from every issue we do, whether we're doing New Orleans, which is our upcoming issue, or Ireland or Mexico, 80% of the writers and photographers at a minimum are from that location. And we love that because we try to bring a cross-section of local voices. So some people are political reporters, some people are sports writers, some people are sort of just essayists writing about kind of personal stories from where they live. And through bringing those different kinds of stories together, we think we get this sort of window into a location. And so that's our approach to storytelling. And as I started doing this work, what I discovered was there were lots of other places and people who were looking for those kinds of approaches and skills. And so we've started doing a lot of consulting for other destinations and storytelling work for other destinations as part of our sort of business office. Instead of sort of carrying traditional advertising, we help people create their own campaigns, which is really fun and has taught me a lot. So I thought I would sort of share a little bit of what I've learned during that time. And so I always start with this, and I know this seems really basic, right? Like, of course, but it's so easy to lose sight of the very, very basic elements of a story. And I actually kind of try to keep this front and center whenever I start talking about storytelling, particularly storytelling that's sort of beginning to move into marketing, where you're really telling a story with a very clear motivating goal in mind for the audience. And that is this, right? That for you to have a good story requires a listener who feels a connection with the storyteller, right? And that connection could be sudden. It could have just occurred, but they need to have made some sort of connection. The story needs to take that audience, that listener, to a place. Place can be the Five and Dime store. It can be a magical universe, but there needs to be a setting. And they need to imagine somebody, whether, whoever it is, somebody that they've come to care about doing something, right? There needs to be an action by a human or an animal or a character of some sort, right? And those are really basic things, but it's so easy to miss one of them, to have this beautiful description of a location, but with no action, no sense of plot, right? Or to have sort of dive into the characters in the description without really having bothered to figure out, well, how did I hook them in? How did I develop that connection point that's so key to making anything else stick? So I just always come back to this, and I really encourage others to as well, even though it seems basic, even though it's sort of like, well, I've been hearing my, grandma telling me once upon a time type stories from childhood. For me, those can be one of the great things to return to, right? When you're trying to get a kid to go to sleep and you're trying to tell a bedtime story, that's to me the ultimate storytelling is marketing, because you have a very clear goal that you're trying to market to your child. And you sort of see, right? You need somebody telling that story who matters to them. The kid doesn't listen if like random person comes in to tell the story. And they need the story to have a sense of place. They need the story of characters they care about, and they need it to sort of have some sense of urgency. What's going to happen next? And then hopefully they fall asleep before they hear the whole thing. That's always the goal. The one distinction, and I have this in here, that I think is important to consider with destination marketing, is it really the main character is the audience, right? The goal is for them to see themselves in this new place, for them to imagine doing something that they care about, doing something exciting in that location. And the other characters, the people you're highlighting, those are really like side characters for your audience to imagine, right? They get to imagine interacting with this person or this person in a sort of hero's journey type way. So moving past the basics, my favorite image to include with any slide. Leo and Kate definitely had an emotional connection, so I like to start with them. But how do we do that? How do you kind of share an emotional connection? My favorite strategy, there are a million ways to do it, right? Because typically with an audience, it's not people you know, although you can sometimes start to attract a returning audience, which gives you tremendous advantage, as we probably all know. But building value statements, to me, is one of the best ways to figure out how to build that connection. And one of the reasons I like it is because it defines audience, and it can define who's not in your audience. Obviously, you're looking for as many people as possible, but when you start to do values exercises, you start to build inherently an emotional connection. And so I thought I would like share one of my favorite values exercises, which is very easy to do in group settings. And I do it like with our staff, and I've actually facilitated it for other people. And it's really simple. You sort of, everyone brainstorms a list of values that are associated with it. And you can, I say values, important descriptive words, right? About a place or about a community or about a business. But you sort of allow as many as possible to get put on a board, right? And then you start a process of winnowing. So you say, we're going to choose 5 of these that are the most important, right? And you start to write out some sentences about those 5. Why is that? Why are those 5 particularly relevant to the community? And then you say, all right, now we have to pick 3. And for these 3, we're going to say, what are things we've done in the past that affirm this description or this value? And inevitably, it's really difficult, especially when you're doing a group. People start to like get really antsy. But you write out these statements together, and you sort of find 3 sentences that make sense. And then you say, okay, or excuse me, start with the 5, and you say why. Then you start with the 3, and you say, what are the actions we've taken? And then you get to you say, all right, well, now we have to pick one of these, and we're going to say, what are we doing in the future that affirms this value, right? So we're going to pick the most important one. And inevitably, right, like the first time you do it, that may not be the one that you pick, may not be the one you go with in the long term. The idea is not that you come away with everything written in pen here. But I think what it starts to do is to build, we think a lot about the statements we use externally that are sort of snappy, but to find statements that you can really back up and that other people, sort of stakeholders in your community that are reflected in the actions you've taken, so that stakeholders, others will say, oh, I hear that. I know that in our community, we really care about, a diversity of small businesses. And that's something that's really special. Or we really care about like creative industries, or we, are passionate about supporting the arts in all sorts of different ways. Whatever it is, when you can find a particular statement like that, one thing it does is it immediately starts to build in an audience, right? Your local audience, as well as all the people you don't know. But 2, it starts to sort of give a sense of like, we care about this thing, and it sort of acknowledges not everyone will, right? Like, this is something we care about. Maybe it's not we just sent out an email recently to our list that sort of was a basic sort of request, for subscriptions. And in it, we said, we feel like this is, there's never been a more critical time for encountering new perspectives and, building global cultural exchange. And a guy wrote us back and said, I don't agree with that. I think I should unsubscribe. And we said, yeah, maybe. I mean, that's a very basic thing. And it can be, you don't want a lot of that. You don't want to pick something that but I think that in a way, there's that sort of famous line from Seth Godin, right? That marketing is sort of people like us do something like this. And when you can establish a value that describes who are the people like us, it's really helpful. And it's helpful in getting buy-in and building emotional connection that really keeps people listening. These people get me. I need to hear more. And one of my favorite examples that I just thought I would highlight are actually two of them. One was in Helsinki, where they really wanted to emphasize the sort of focus on freedom. And so they had 5 different creative individuals, or individual working creative industries, create their own little mini shows, and they turned it into a movie. And, you can do this a lot of ways. You don't just need to do video. You can do this through all sorts of things. Whether it's writing, whether it's imagery, it's social media, obviously all the different ones. But the idea of sort of saying, here are 5 people who are going to talk about LGBTQ rights. They're also going to talk about, access to trails and the freedom to go outside all the time, the freedom to there's a lot of public spaces in Helsinki, right? The freedom to be in public spaces. And they really created this theme of freedom and leaned into it in a way, again, that I think defined who a lot of people would see that and say, this is for me. And a small percentage of people may see it and say, this isn't for me. But those people who see it and lean in are much more likely to keep listening, to keep hearing, well, what does it have to offer? Oh, they have these things, that's great too, because they heard that they established that initial connection. Similarly, I thought it was really nice to visit Scotland in this sort of reopening has been focused on this idea of visit Scotland responsibly, right? And it's a little bit, I would say, edgier than the way I think destination marketing was a few years ago. It's a little bit more hard line around, don't leave a trail, leave only footprints and, take only pictures. But it's really, I think, as an increasing number of people identify strongly with the idea of sustainable tourism and what it is to sort of travel sustainably and ethically, that campaign is really effective, because they hear that and they say, oh, this community, these people, they see it the way I do. I want to go to a place where I can travel in that way and know I'm not having a negative impact. So that is established. That's sort of my view of establishing emotional connection. And again, if anyone has thoughts or questions, please throw them out there.
Yeah, and Abby, I just wanted to jump in and say that I really resonate with what you're saying, because oftentimes when we talk about, the sort of concept with, if you're marketing to everyone, you're marketing to no one, right? So you have to be more specific in order to make the connection. But I often tell people, in a world where we've moved beyond demographics into psychographics, really sometimes niche marketing into values makes more sense than niche marketing into age groups or things like that, because the idea of freedom as a value or responsibility as a value, think of all the different types of people that can connect to that. So I just really appreciate what you're saying, because I think it's really, like I said, sometimes the demographics conversation, I'm like, we have to stretch past that, because really people aren't just buying because of their gender or their age or their location anymore. They're buying a lot because of their own feelings about things. So
it's so true. And especially you see those funny generation hopping, right? Where you sort of discover that my 18-year-old and my old hippie parents who are now in their late 70s, right? Really connect on certain things that I feel a little bit my Gen X husband and my kind of somewhat millennial self are sort of oh, okay, cool. And so I think that's to your point, right? That there's these really interesting themes that can be experienced in different ways. And so then the next point, which I think is really a journalism precept, but I think is one of the great kind of things to draw from journalism, is keeping it specific, right? So the more, show don't tell is sort of the famous byline of journalism and journalism storytelling. But it's so true that to do that, what you need are specific things, right? So it's not just, I went to a party, but I went to, a gala and there were things on the wall and this on the floor and people were dancing and, you get that. And one of the things I always like to highlight is the extent to which places, some of the best destination marketing has come for places that don't really exist, right? And my favorites, which are up here, of course, would be Alice in Wonderland. Who doesn't imagine themselves in Wonderland? And I was a nerdy, bookish child. I'm sure be shocked to hear, but given what I do now, but I think, when you read Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland, you imagine yourself there, you imagine what's happening, you sort of want to be a part of it because it sounds so exciting. And that's not because it's got catchy slogans. It's because it's really in the details, right? It's sort of the cups and the Mad Hatter and you sort of get this sense of place. And it's similar with Hogwarts, right? Like those I think are two of the great sort of locations that we can't actually visit, but we all kind of wish we could. And so how do you do that? How do you like build, your own version of that? I think so much has to do with identifying specific voices, identifying characters in your community, in the location that you can highlight. One of the projects that we did last year that was really wonderful was with a small town in Texas called Martindale, and a group of businesses there that were trying to do some creative work to bring more tourism. And we just very simply went around and interviewed all of the small business owners on the main street, and we got sort of just a like first person narration of their story, which we edited into a little kind of small essay. And not all of them are used all the time, but it gave the community this sort of deep resource of these narratives, of these sort of characters that they can lean into in different ways, right? So depending on what they're emphasizing at any time in their community. Right now, our big focus is getting people in for music, and we have a big festival. Well, let's highlight these two stores that are mainstays of those festivals, or that are just musicians themselves and locally drawn to that same music. But really trying to think about who are the characters, like lowercase c characters in your community, and starting to build almost like a sort of personae dramatis of those people, right? That you can draw on depending on what you're trying to emphasize. The other thing you can do is sort of do specifics of locations, right? So like, describing a park in a lot more detail, right, whatever the scene or the event is, really delving into it so that when you're telling these stories and you're figuring things out, you have these sort of blocks that you can bring in, whether it's the character and their story or it's the location and their story, but really being able to make sure that the details are a big part of building that kind of compendium, if that makes sense. One of my favorite examples of this, which I thought I assume people have seen because it crossed my desk sort of a few different ways, but it was the Oregon Slightly Exaggerated campaigns, which are really interesting, right? Because they're sort of this imaginary world, and it's all done in illustrations, and I'm sure it was bazillion dollars to make. But one of the things that they're very key about or clear about is that every location that they chose to highlight is very specifically not exaggerated, right? So they have all this crazy stuff happening. There's a giant bunny rabbit and kids are riding it, and there are whales in the sky, and all sorts of crazy imaginary stuff is happening, but it's happening in a place that looks like Oregon, right? Like it looks like Portland. It looks like, the different parks of Oregon, right? And I think that's extremely effective when you're doing creative kinds of projects, even if it's with, the local high school, right, in a small town, making sure that you can blend imagination and creativity with the real, with the specifics of what's actually there, and sort of giving people that framework is really effective for just keeping things in people's mind. I just think a story is memorable when you have, an image in your head, and it's hard to have an image if you don't have specifics. The specifics are what color it in. And so then we get to this last point, which is creating plot. And then I can talk a little bit more about each of these, but creating plot is in some ways the hardest, I think, because it's the idea of how do you create urgency? How do you create, sorry, my computer is being a little weird. How do you create urgency? How do you create this sense that things are moving in a direction? I always go back to those sort of value statements, right? Can you sort of show where you're headed? Can you say, we are investing in X, we are moving towards Y, we're becoming, right? Because that's always exciting for people who are just getting to know a place and feel like they can be a part of it. But it's also part of the story, right? So you've sort of established this emotional connection with somebody. You've now given them the specifics. So we've established a connection. We're now in the castle. We're in the, where we're in Austin, Texas, right? But we've got the place and we've got the characters. And so then when people hear, here's where they're going, here's where those people I heard about are going, or here's where I could be, what I could be a part of, that to me is like the key last piece, right? Value statements can be a great way to do that. A different way to do that is to really make sure when you're collecting information, whether it's from local voices or what have you, to make sure that not only are there I see a lot when we work with our partners, that we get a lot of like reflections, why I like to be here, why I love this place. And those are great. I mean, that's really important. It's not, this is absolutely a yes and, right? But reflections themselves are very static. Here we are, this is what we do, this is what we like, it's great. But rather really asking those people, well, how did you come here? Did you always feel this way about this place? What made you like it more? What made you, if you're interviewing that person, they've come to be probably a pretty big, booster for their community. So how did that happen? People didn't just wake up one day that way. So what is that story? And then how can that story be used or amplified when you're explaining it to an audience? Because I think it's easy to get lost. What I see the most are overly general descriptions. So very sort of that aren't sort of in the details, and then descriptions, it sort of ends with that description, right? So we don't hear about what it used to be like, what was this place like 20 years ago, and how is it different? How is it different in ways that maybe were challenging, but now you're starting to address? I think one thing about plot that can be a little bit scary, but because I come more from a journalism background, I think I'm always encouraging people to consider is to look at things in their community that weren't so great, or things that maybe they weren't so proud of, and how's the community worked on them, right? Don't bring up the thing that's a 5-alarm fire at the moment. That's probably not the thing but there are a million areas where communities are actively making progress. Our community wasn't as friendly to people from a diversity of backgrounds. We've made that a priority. Here's how we've begun to address that problem. We're really excited about what we're doing. I think people should be much more willing to look at the successes in their community and be willing to tell those stories, even if they have to start from a place that's a little scary, right? Hey, we weren't where we wanted to be on, sustainability, and we've made these steps, and we have these plans to make more steps. The other thing that's really exciting, I think, about those stories is when you can start from one place. And again, this is in some ways really obvious, but I think in practice can be really challenging, is remembering to not have the story complete, right? So you sort of say, we started here, we're moving forward, and we're at this point, and we have big plans, right? And so making sure you have those 3 distinct parts to a plot is a really key thing. And that's true when it's some of the stories I'm talking about, which are a little bit more starting from a more troubling spot. It's true if it's telling a story of just growth, right? Or sort of expansion, or of reclaiming something, right? Like we now have way more parks, or we've become a music capital, and here's what we've done. It still requires, we started, you don't need to dwell on it, but we started and realized we needed more music. We've now done X, Y, and Z, and we have these festivals, and it's great, and they're growing, and they're going to be even better next year, right? So something to kind of give the audience a sense that the story's not done, and that they're a part of it moving forward. Because again, I think really considering the audience member as their own main character is really clarifying when you think about marketing in this sort of storytelling vein. A couple examples that I just think were really interesting. Visit Israel really leaned into COVID. And I think a lot of places didn't, it was so hard to figure out what to do, how to sort of tell those stories. And Israel was very clear, like their new landmark was their vaccination rate, and was their sort of their vaccination passport and was their sort of sense of safe security. And in telling that story, they were pretty, they were, and they were doing that in 2021. So it was sort of still when things were, so different in different places. And I think it was really interesting to really lean into the pandemic's not over. We're still moving, but we've taken these steps and we feel like we're moving in a direction in ways that distinguish us, which is always key, and that make you want to come see. My other just like favorite thing, period, is like Australia's 2018 Super Bowl ad, which includes Channing Tatum and the guy whose name I'm forgetting, but a comedian, Danny McBride, there we go, it came to me, pretending to do Crocodile Dundee before you discover that like there is no movie, they're just doing an ad for Australia. It's really funny. So I just, if you haven't somehow seen it, you should. But I think it's also really effective in sort of, you get to kind of identify with the different people, like, oh, here's the suave guy, here's the sort of clueless guy, going through Australia. But also it gives you a sense of like, hey, this wasn't the Australia of Crocodile Dundee, right? Like this is sort of giving you a new image. Things have changed over time. And here we're showing you this new version of a place that you should come and be a part of. And so those are my main, I think this started with 3 points. So those are my top 3. And I moved, but I want to allow like time for questions or comments. And so Sarah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, or if any of this like rings totally false to you, I'd be super curious.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I want to encourage everyone, if you've got questions for Abby, or you're working on a campaign right now and you want to sort of workshop a little bit how to tell the story in a stronger way, please feel free. I know it takes everybody a minute to chat in some things. But I do have a few questions myself that I think I'd love for you to dig in a little deeper on. The first thing, just like because you touched on sort of the Visit Israel campaign, again, I feel like, especially in the United States, the issue of COVID became a really dramatic, emotional story for a lot of us. I know in Asheville, as a tourism town, a lot of our, not just our actual like tourism marketing, our TDA, our DMO, but also like individual businesses really struggled because we had so many people coming from different places, and every different place that they came from, people had different values and opinions and things like that. And so we've had to work really hard as a community to figure out how do we unite a little, maybe in like our community kind of stance on things. And there was some work on that. But could you just talk a little bit about, in telling the stories around something that can sometimes be so emotionally charged, have you talked to some of your destinations about that? Like, how are you all kind of just dealing with that? Because I think as a journalist, when you're doing journalism, you're talking about a lot of hard things.
Totally.
In marketing, we've historically, I think, avoided a lot of that because we don't know what to do about it. And I think that's a big paradigm shift in marketing right now, is we're becoming more transparent and honest and telling stories that are real and true, instead of kind of selling you something all the time. So I'm just curious if you could feedback a little on that.
So it's interesting. So it's really hard. Like I unfortunately do not have like the golden, just do this and it'll be, here's this powder, you just sprinkle over everything, it'll be fine. So I wish if somebody in the audience has that, let me know. But I do, it's really interesting. One of the other things we do at Strangers Guide is a lot of work in peace building communities. And so communities are working, primarily in conflict zones in different parts of the world. And one of the big conversations happening in that space has been around like, what can US communities learn from all this work that's been done in other hyperpolarized and challenged places, right? And I think one of the big questions is, where are areas that are less polarized? Like, what can you find a thing that people can agree to, and it may be a narrow window, but really leaning into that. And that's a real key from kind of public conversations type thing, right? So, in a lot of communities, there'll be this conversation of the example that I sort of always learn from, and I'll get this back to your question, but the example I was learned from was, there's a community, I forget where in the United States, where you had a pretty serious teen pregnancy challenge. And you had obviously and this couldn't be more polarized than this today, but you had people with very different views on the questions of how best to do that. But everyone could basically agree on certain stuff to support girls who are already pregnant, right? And so there was a sense of we can come together around supporting the women who are pregnant, the young girls who are pregnant, and sort of helping them get what they needed to support them and support their children. And it was an interesting community exercise because it brought together people who really didn't see eye to eye on a lot of the typical issues that surround those topics, right? And so I think about that a little bit when it comes to, because now we live in a time when everything is sort of a political battleground. And I think the great thing about place-based stuff is that sometimes you can still find areas of people who get really excited about the same thing. So can you get really excited about parks? Pretty much everyone felt, outdoor spaces was a space that people were feeling pretty comfortable in. So are parks a way that you can begin to get people get excited? Can there be ways of communicating that the whole community gets behind that just bring clarity? Because I think one of the other things that was happening with COVID was unclear expectations when you walked into different stores or different events, and you're sort of getting either chided for not wearing a mask, or you're feeling, everybody's, or you're feeling silly for having your mask on, right? Having a sort of sense of what are the expectations? And I've seen a lot of useful, not so much with communities, but with sort of particular organizations that work across political divides, where they've done a lot with different sort of symbols that mean different things, and the whole kind of community builds on that one. If you, in your store you want everyone to be masked, you'll have a purple sign on the door. And if yours is a shop where masking is completely optional, use a green sticker, right? And so something like that to sort of build a sense of a code that everyone can kind of agree on. And then there's at least shared language. And I think it's also really helpful, like I said, to sort of try to identify what are things, whether they're outdoors things, whether they're digital things, that sort of build community, and that are sort of, you're able to depoliticize in some way. But it's tricky with COVID. I mean, I think one of the unique things about Israel was that there really wasn't there was pretty high trust in the government's approach, and it was not especially unpopular. So, lucky for them, they get to tell that story. And for those of us, I mean, I live in Austin, Texas. So, the gaps of where people saw things during COVID were huge. But I also think there are some lessons. I think some of the last groups to be fairly broad. So I went to events, some faith-based groups, some animal rights groups, sort of animal welfare groups are some of the last spaces that I think haven't been as polarized. And that's where I think you see some of that's where those ideas have come from for me, have been the ideas of can we, oh, sorry, I can stop sharing my screen,
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in and say that, I just appreciate what you're saying, because again, one of the things in Asheville that I think has been sort of a bridge is definitely around our creative sector. When we talk about building up our arts community here and supporting them and elevating them, we really see a lot of support from every aisle.
Yeah.
And I actually went to up to DC in March, and I actually was learning how to lobby Congress. But one of the things that I did was I lobbied one of our senators here in North Carolina. And that was actually my pitch to them, right? That in North Carolina, no matter where you sit politically, one of the things that we know is that the creative sector in our state is really big. And would he consider crossing the aisle to work with Democrats to support something that would really infuse money into the creative sector here. And I mean, it was more well received than I expected, right? Especially since I'm coming from a very different other side of the political aisle to our senator. So I just think it's really interesting for all of us to think about that, because many of us, especially if we're based in the Southeast, but I think it's actually happening across the country everywhere, really, but especially in the Southeast, you often are bringing people together that are just coming from very different value statements. And so it's like looking for that uniting part of the story.
Yeah.
Like, what is it that your community can
It's
really
something
connect with?
I'm super passionate about with Strangers Guide. That's actually one of our core values, is trying to bring together stories that you would typically find in a very kind of political atmosphere, right? So we have an issue coming out on New Orleans, and there's a piece that takes, is sort of about the jail there and life in the jail. That's a piece you would see in like kind of heavier kinds of magazines. But we also have pieces on like the history of baseball in North Carolina, in New Orleans, right? And sort of tons on music and just the history of music, history of food. And the goal there is to allow people, even people who maybe are going to be polarized by some of the stories, to connect with something else and maybe give some other perspectives a chance. Because our whole goal is to just build more space for people to encounter differing perspectives. And so, yeah, it's a real, but it's something that I think in a way, destination marketing is uniquely situated to do. And it's so needed just from a civic perspective.
Yeah, totally. The other question I wanted to ask, and again, feel free, anyone on the call today, to jump in if you have specific things you want to talk about before we wrap. But I was curious about when we started talking about the values, making the statements and then prioritizing. So this is another thing I think my clients and students all sort of struggle with, is a lot of us, there are so many stories we could tell. There are so many things that we care about. And if we really look at our world, there are so many problems that we have to solve. And so for those of us who are really looking to build companies or build brands or build destinations that are contributing, right, to the problem solving and making people's lives better, for those of us who really care about that impact, when you have sort of this plethora of stories that you can work with, can you talk a little bit more about like, how do you help your clients dig into what is the priority, right? Because I feel like that's something that's always hard for people. Like we get to the top 5 things or the top 3 things. We'll be lucky if we get there. Sometimes we're at the top 10 or 20. But, one of those questions is, how do we really say like, this is what's got to take priority in the next month or 3 months or whatever we're doing?
So I find a really useful way to get people, because at the end of the day, you just, you sort of, there's no way but through, right? Like, but one of the things I think can be really helpful is to build out a calendar so that when you say like, we're going to choose A, not B or C, you see where B and C could be later on. And, maybe they end up being there, maybe they don't, but it's a lot. It's, I don't know if you have the challenge we have in our house, which is too much stuff. And I've discovered that one of my husband particularly is too much stuff. And one of the things that really helps him get rid of stuff is when you say, we're giving it to this thing, it's when it has a home where it's going, right? And I think similarly with like priorities and values, it's not that they're not important. It's not that, by highlighting one, you're somehow saying the others don't matter. But you've got to highlight one or you're going to do a disservice to all 3 of them, right? To all 3 values. And so I think what I like to do with my clients and partners is to sort of map out, all right, for the next, let's say 3 months, like A is what we are focused on. And that's okay because B and C are coming. And another thing that can be, I think, really efficient when you're sort of doing things like collecting stories and collecting content is to sort of, if you here are the 5, right, that here are the 5 buckets. And, bucket A is where we are going to be leaning everything in right now. When you're collecting stuff, you can still tag everything and build out everything so that, I talked to, this guy who's, Mr. Storytelling for my community. And he tells me a dozen great stories. He brings to light a million great things. Only a third of it is useful for that A point that we're really emphasizing right now. But I make sure that I've got all of his other comments cataloged so that when 6 months from now we're at point C, I have a mechanism for knowing that that's there as well. And so I think that can be a key thing, is that when I think there can be real inefficiencies in how content gets collected. And I think this is actually, I came up through like small independent publications where like, you sort of everything's held together with like shoestring and scotch tape. And because of that, the idea of when you go out, when I was sort of telling stories about political reporting in Texas, when I would go out there, I would try to get like 10 stories because it costs so much to send me out. I couldn't just do the one story that they were sending me out for, but those other stories weren't necessarily going to be published immediately. And I think that old school, that's like an alt weekly newspaper approach, but that's actually a really good approach for storytelling collecting that can mitigate a little bit of that sense of like loss, right? It's so hard to, it's like, by saying one, am I saying, it's like my children to sort of, get rid of some of these, or my cats, but like, I don't want to lose these other things. So those are, I don't know if that's useful, but those have been definitely strategies that help for me. But I think I also just do it over and over again until they pick one, like, hey, we've done this 4 times and this one is always in the top 3 every time we've done it.
Yeah, I really, and thanks for your comment, Betsy, that you're in Southport, North Carolina, and you'd love to connect because you really believe in the power of the story. So yeah, that's definitely, I think, something that Abby and I really get behind. I want to let everybody know, I did put a link into our class in the chat as we're coming to the top of the hour. So Abby and I will be teaching a class on May 25th. We'd love for you all to consider coming and actually doing like a deeper dive on this topic and really help mine some stories that you want to work on. But as we're wrapping up the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to get one more opinion from you, Abby, about something, which is, I feel like in a lot of ways, and I'm going to use Asheville as an example because I've lived here for 23 years. And I feel like I've watched it go from a place that nobody knew about to a place that everybody knows about. And so like the way that we do things here, when I think back to the year 2000, I compare it to 2022, it's like night and day, how we even market ourselves. It's like we've become a completely different destination. And I think businesses here have really had to evolve alongside of that as well. But, one of the things I'm really encouraging people to think about is, sometimes I think we get stuck on, we go after the same audiences with the same stories over and over because we're comfortable there and because we're sure that it'll produce some type of result or response. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about like unearthing some things that maybe people don't know about yet. So could you just take a minute to talk about like the real value in doing that? And maybe at this point, expanding outside of what you've always talked about in regards to your brand and like looking for things that maybe are kind of like jewels that you haven't figured are there yet?
Absolutely. And I will say that's like just a plug. I think that like there will be some activities on that when we do our little, we haven't talked about this yet, but I was actually looking because I think it's really important. And you see the success, right? Like when places are able to start to evolve what they're doing, it's really exciting. Yeah, you're asking me if it's important or how to do it. Because
how are you talking to your clients about getting out of their sort of story rut, right? Like I think Asheville is a place where we will tell the same story about the same brands over and over and over. And, I've been advocating that we have to also look at the stories we have not traditionally told. Not because I think there's some fear it will scare away the people that we're already bringing, but it will actually bring in people that we've never brought before.
We've never brought in before.
So I know we've only got a minute, but I'm just curious.
So in my to be continued till 2 weeks from now. But I'll say, I think a couple of things. I mean, I do think going back to that conversation about plot, right? Like when you start to say, well, let's look at how the communities evolved. What are stories, successful stories, happy ending, but we're not doing endings, but happy stories we can tell about our community that weren't true 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, we weren't even thinking about, a great example is climate, right? I think so many communities are doing creative, impactful work that 20 years ago was not on their radar. It was not a mainstream thing to be thinking about in towns in the US. And, now, there's composting and community gardens, and we've created all of these wildflowers or, if you love that, you should come explore that. I think when you can frame it in terms of like, we have successes that we have a story. It's not just like, hey, we're this now, right? Because I think that's what scares people. Like, hey, we were, you know, a great place to feel homey, and now we are, you know, an edgy artistic venue, right? That's like scares people. But because it's sort of very static, right? We were this, now we are that. I think if you can sort of say, like, what are like what are sort of successful story arcs, happy story arcs that we have, you know, that we haven't shared with people and that aren't sort of static. It's not that we are this now, but hey, did you know this little mom and pop place was able to build a music education program that is, you know, the top one, and people are coming from all around. Like, do you know that? You love us, and now we assume you would want to know this new story or this success that we've had. I think that can be a way in that's a little bit less anxiety provoking, because I think at the end of the day, like, place is so wrapped up in identity that when you start to sort of say we should frame ourselves as a new thing, it feels like a loss for people who are wrapped up in the old identity. But if you can sort of say, hey, look what we with our identity have accomplished, and you can, then I think it's a little bit less threatening. So
and thank you.
Approach.
Yeah, I feel like you really nailed it, because I think it's about, you know, you don't have to give up your identity to tell the story with a different plot, with a different character, with something that highlights those things we've never talked about before. But I love what you said about, it's not about saying we were this and now we're this, because I do think that's what scares everyone. That's so well said. I think, you know, especially when we're talking about businesses or destinations that have been around for a long time, it's like you said, they don't want to lose something or sacrifice something. And it's like, I just love that you said it that way, because I think it's about, no, you're going to expand to become more. You're not going to give up who you were to turn into something completely different. And I think that's like a really important reframe that we all want to consider when we're thinking about moving into the future, because there's a lot of changes.
What happened? No, I mean, I know we're over time, but I will just add to that. Like, I mean, I do think, like, we all know, like, empathy is like a key thing in storytelling. It's an overused word probably, but I do think in those contexts, especially, like, being empathetic to people who are there, you know, who sort of like built that original identity, right? It's, I do think that's a key piece to it too, because it's so frustrating when you're like, but don't you see? This is so obvious. Like, we just need to be leaning into this stuff. And it's so hard. And I do think if you can sort of come from a place of empathy around that struggle for them, and sort of think about, like, what did they need for this to feel safe and not feel like threatening and sort of existential. That's, you know, that's usually a good way to get some results. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Abby. I have to just say, like, this conversation alone, I'm so excited to teach our class on the 25th. I think it's going to be really fun. Again, I put the link in the chat. Also, you all will get the recording and the slide deck, and I'll share some information about the class as well. But I hope you'll consider joining us on May 25th. We're going to talk, not only dig deeper into more of what Abby just shared and really how to mine stories, we're going to talk a little bit about the science of storytelling and neuroscience and the brain. And so we can really kind of dig into that empathy piece and think about the people we want to connect with. But I really appreciate everyone spending their lunch hour with us as usual. I hope you will come and join us next month for our digital drop-in, which will be the first Wednesday, and it will be about ethical marketing and email marketing. So we'll be talking about really the ethics involved in building your email lists and making connections with people. But Abby, again, thank you so much. You're just such a delight to listen to. I feel like I've learned a whole bunch today, which is super helpful. But everyone else, it's great to see you, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
See you later, everyone.